So Catherine just made Camilla take off Diana's brooch in front of the entire royal family. And Charles didn't stop her. And honestly, the reason he didn't stop her is the part that's actually going to make you furious. Before we get into all of it, hit subscribe real quick. We cover royal stories like this every week, and you genuinely don't want to miss where this one goes. All right, let's start where the story actually begins, not at the banquet, but 3 weeks earlier when Camilla first asked Charles for something she had absolutely no right to ask for. Okay, so here's the part that actually gets crazy. Catherine stood up in the middle of a state banquet at Windsor Castle on the night of the 9th of May and told the staff to stop the service completely. Not quietly, not with a whisper to an aide. She stood up in front of foreign guests, in front of Charles, in front of Camilla, and she made it stop. And honestly, the reason is what gets people. Camilla was wearing Diana's brooch. Like, think about that for a second. This wasn't some random piece of jewelry from the royal collection. This was a piece tied directly to Diana, worn by the woman who came after her at one of the most formal, most photographed events in the royal calendar. And Catherine recognized it instantly. Here's the thing you need to understand. Catherine doesn't do scenes. In 9 years of public royal life, she has never once broken protocol in front of cameras. She's the calm one, the controlled one. So when she stood up and asked out loud, "Why are you wearing it?" that question landed like a verdict, not a complaint. And genuinely, the room went cold. Servers stopped mid-step. Guests turned toward the head table. William stood up half a second after her, not to calm her down, but just to make sure she wasn't standing alone. Charles, according to people close to the family, leaned toward Camilla and told her quietly to take it off. Not in 20 minutes, not after the dessert course. Right then at the table in front of everyone. And here's what actually makes this insane. Camilla hesitated. Just one breath. But in a room full of people trained their entire lives to read micro-expressions and pauses, that one breath looked like defiance. Basically, in the space of about 90 seconds, a quiet family disagreement about a piece of jewelry turned into the most public royal confrontation Britain has seen in years. Camilla eventually removed the brooch. The banquet resumed technically, but nobody in that room believed the evening had actually recovered. And that's the part that should stop you cold. Because this didn't come out of nowhere. Catherine didn't wake up that morning and decide to make a scene. Someone had asked for permission to wear that brooch weeks before. And the person who said yes was the one man in the family who had the power to say no. What happened in the 3 weeks before that banquet? That's the part nobody's talking about yet, and it's the part that actually explains everything. Now, here's what makes this even more significant than royal wears, controversial jewelry. Because on the surface, sure, it's a story about a brooch, but underneath this is a story about who gets to define Diana's legacy and who gets to decide when old wounds are considered healed enough to use for public image. Let me explain what's actually happening here. Inside the royal family, personal jewelry that belonged to Diana isn't treated like normal inheritance. It's kept in what's called a private jewelry archive, basically a guarded record of who owns each piece, who's allowed to wear it, and who has to approve that request. Right now, William effectively controls access to Diana's most personal items, and that includes anything symbolically tied to her. So when Camilla wanted to wear that brooch, she wasn't just picking an outfit. She needed sign-off. And that's a detail most people watching this story completely miss. Here's why Catherine cares about this on a level that has nothing to do with politics. She's watched William carry his mother's absence his entire adult life. Genuinely, every major royal milestone, his wedding, his children's christenings, official portraits, Diana's absence sits right underneath the surface. Catherine has spent years protecting that wound quietly, never turning it into a public talking point, never using it for sympathy. And that's exactly why this hit different for her. Because to Catherine, using Diana's brooch to signal the family has moved on wasn't reconciliation. It was borrowing someone else's grief to make an old scandal look resolved. Now, here's a detail that should make you sit up. Camilla didn't ask Catherine for permission. She didn't ask William directly either. She went straight to Charles, the one person in the family least likely to say no to her and most likely to avoid confrontation altogether. And honestly, that's the pattern with Camilla. She's not reckless, she's strategic. She reads the family dynamics better than almost anyone gives her credit for, and she knew exactly which door to knock on. That detail going around William, going around Catherine, straight to Charles, that's the part that changes everything that came before it. because it means this wasn't an impulsive fashion choice. It was a calculated move, and it makes what happened 3 weeks earlier in a quiet room at Kensington Palace almost impossible to look away from. But to truly understand why Catherine could stand up at that banquet without flinching, you have to go back further than most people realize. This didn't start at the state banquet. It started 18 days earlier inside a small private meeting at Kensington Palace about Diana's memorial tribute. Most people remember the banquet. What most people forget is the meeting that came before it, the one where Catherine asked for exactly one thing. She asked that Diana's brooch remain untouched until William personally decided what should happen to it. Not sold, not displayed, not worn, just left alone in its case until he was ready. And here's the part that honestly turns the stomach a little. William didn't even want to open the case. Sophie, who was in the room, later described how he just stared at it silent for almost a full minute before someone else finally closed the lid. Like this is not new. William's relationship with anything tied to Diana goes back to childhood, to the exact moment he learned to associate his mother's memory with public performance instead of private grief. He was 15 when he walked behind her coffin in 1997 in front of millions of people, and he spent basically every year since trying to keep pieces of her away from that same kind of spectacle. So when Catherine made that request, leave the brooch alone, she wasn't being controlling. She was protecting the one thing William has never fully recovered from. Charles was in that meeting too. And when William told him directly that the brooch should stay untouched, Charles said nothing. He didn't promise. He didn't refuse either. He just let the silence sit there. And genuinely, that silence hurt Catherine more than an outright no would have, because a no she could push back on. Silence just meant the door stayed open. Sophie later told Catherine quietly through a private conversation that Camilla had approached Charles about the brooch that same evening, just hours after William had asked for it to be left alone. That timing is the detail that should make you stop and reread this. Camilla didn't wait weeks to make her move. She made it the very night William asked for restraint. And that's the part that turns this from a misunderstanding into something that looks a lot more deliberate. And this is the detail that stopped me cold when I first read it. Camilla's request wasn't vague or casual. According to an account later shared through a senior palace aide, she specifically asked Charles whether she could wear the brooch at the upcoming state banquet, the same banquet scheduled for the 9th of May, 3 weeks out, as what she called a gesture of unity in front of visiting foreign dignitaries. The plan was actually pretty clever if you think about it. A state banquet is about as public and symbolic as royal events get. Millions of photographs, international press. If Camilla wore that brooch there, the message wouldn't need a single word of explanation. It would say instantly to the entire world, the past is settled, the family has healed, Camilla belongs. And honestly, staggering is the right word for how far this actually went. She wasn't just asking to wear a nice piece of jewelry. She was asking to use Diana literally physically to finish rewriting her own public story. Charles, according to people familiar with the conversation, didn't say a firm yes, but he didn't say no either. And in royal circles, that kind of non-answer from the monarch is basically read as permission, especially by someone as experienced in palace politics as Camilla. So over the following 18 days, the plan moved forward quietly. The brooch was requested from the archive. Approval, at least informally, was treated as granted. Camilla's stylist reportedly built the entire banquet gown around the piece, positioning it front and center, not tucked away as an afterthought. Does any of that sound like a spontaneous styling choice, or does it sound like something planned down to the last detail? She had been building toward this moment for almost 3 weeks, and she was one dinner away from pulling it off completely, one photograph away from rewriting decades of public perception in a single evening. But here's what Camilla didn't know. Sophie had already told Catherine everything days before the banquet even happened. Catherine wasn't blindsided at that table. She walked into that banquet already knowing exactly what she might see. And what she chose to do with that information, that's the part nobody saw coming. Okay, so here's the part that actually changes everything. Catherine didn't find out about the brooch at the banquet table. She found out 4 days before through a quiet conversation with Sophie, the same conversation where Sophie repeated details she'd heard from a senior aide who kept a private record of the archive request. And this is the moment where the whole story shifts because up until now, you might think Catherine's reaction was pure impulse grief bursting out in public without warning. It wasn't. She had 4 days to sit with this information before she ever set foot in that banquet hall. What Catherine learned in that conversation changed the entire picture. It wasn't just that Camilla wanted to wear the brooch, it was that the request had gone specifically to Charles, specifically after William had asked for restraint, and specifically with the banquet's foreign guest list already in mind. In other words, the timing wasn't coincidence. It was strategy. And here's the detail that really lands. Sophie mentioned this wasn't the first time that particular brooch had caused alarm, as she put it. There had been at least one earlier moment months prior where the same piece had been quietly requested and quietly declined by a senior household member before it ever reached Charles's desk. That detail matters because it tells you Camilla had tried this before, quietly, and been turned down. This time she went around the person who said no and up to the one man unlikely to say it again. Catherine told William what she'd learned, and according to people close to the couple, William's first instinct wasn't anger, it was disbelief. He genuinely didn't think his father would let it happen twice. Now, some of you are probably asking why Catherine didn't just confront Camilla privately before the banquet and avoid the whole public moment altogether. And honestly, that's a fair question. But here's the thing, Catherine reportedly didn't fully believe Camilla would go through with it in front of international guests. Sophie's information was strong, but it wasn't confirmed until the moment Camilla actually walked into that banquet hall wearing it. So Catherine had the truth. She had 4 days to prepare. What she didn't have yet was certainty, not until she saw the brooch with her own eyes pinned exactly where Sophie said it would be. And that's the part that makes what happened next feel less like an outburst and more like something Catherine had already decided quietly days in advance. What she chose to do with that certainty, that's the countermove nobody in that banquet hall was ready for. Ban muon min taip tuk, chapter sao din muoi kong. Tiep tuk 5 chapter kon lai kong goi hin an. Orchestrated continuation of 5 chapters, maintaining consistent structure. Orchestrated continuation of 5 chapters, maintaining consistent structure. He didn't make a speech. Catherine didn't give an interview. What she did was quiet, immediate, and honestly kind of brilliant when you think about it. The moment she saw the brooch on Camilla's gown, Catherine didn't pull William aside. She didn't send a note through an aide. She stood up herself in full view of everyone and asked the service to stop. That's it. No dramatic accusation, no raised voice, just one sentence and one question. Why are you wearing it? And here's why that specific move mattered so much. If Catherine had waited, if she'd handled this privately after the dinner, the photographs would already exist. The story the next morning would have been, Camilla wears Diana's brooch, family looks united, full stop. There'd be no way to walk that back once it was captured on camera and shared with foreign press. By stopping the service in real time, Catherine made sure the story could never be that simple. She created a second image, herself standing, refusing to sit down, refusing to smile through it, and that image was just as public, just as photographed as anything Camilla was hoping to create. Now, some of you are probably asking whether Catherine even had the standing to do something like that at a state event. And the answer is basically yes, because of who she is, not what title she holds. She has no formal authority over royal protocol. But she has something Camilla doesn't, the public's trust, and William standing beside her without hesitation. Charles, according to accounts from that evening, told Camilla directly to remove the brooch, quietly at the table but firmly enough that it wasn't optional. That was Charles's own countermove forced into existence by Catherine's decision to make the moment impossible to ignore. And here's the part that's actually kind of remarkable. Later that night, Catherine made one more move. She asked to speak with Camilla privately. No aides, no advisors, no prepared statements, just the two of them in a private sitting room away from the cameras and the noise. In that room, Camilla took the brooch out of its case and placed it on the table between them. She said she wouldn't wear it again. That's the entire countermove. No lawsuit, no press release, no public punishment. Catherine got exactly one thing, a boundary spoken directly with no one else in the room to soften it or spin it. And genuinely, that's how this family operates when something actually changes. Not through statements, through one quiet, irreversible conversation that nobody else gets to hear. The brooch was off, the promise was made, but the counter-move happening behind closed doors is never the whole story, because outside those palace walls, one single image from that banquet was about to become the only thing anyone in Britain was talking about. And here's the thing, nobody made an official statement that night. No palace press release went out immediately. But the message was already completely clear because one photograph had already gotten out. The image was simple. Camilla seated mid-conversation, one hand resting near her collarbone where the brooch had been. Catherine standing several feet away, her expression calm but unmoving. William beside her, not seated, not smiling, just present. To an outsider, that might look like nothing, three people at a dinner table. But in the royal world, every single gesture carries meaning, and this one told a very specific story. Catherine standing while everyone else remained seated wasn't just body language. It was a public refusal to pretend the moment hadn't happened. The clip and the still photograph spread everywhere within about 6 hours. People slowed it down, zoomed in, compared Camilla's expression before and after the brooch came off. Because what it showed was uncomfortable, a queen consort visibly caught, and a future queen visibly unwilling to let it slide. A major newspaper ran the image the next morning under one line, "The brooch that stopped the palace." And that headline did more work than any palace statement could have. It framed Catherine as protective, not disruptive. It framed Camilla as the one who'd overstepped, not the one who'd been wronged. Here's what makes this even more significant. Outside Kensington Palace that same morning, a small group of people left white flowers near the gates. A quiet public tribute to Diana sparked entirely by the story spreading online. That's not something a palace communications team can manufacture. That's the public deciding on its own that this story touched something real. William reportedly understood the risk immediately. Public sympathy is powerful, but it's also unpredictable. It can reopen exactly the kind of scrutiny the family has spent decades trying to manage. Once Diana's name re-enters the national conversation at that scale, nobody fully controls where it goes next. Camilla, meanwhile, was photographed leaving a private chapel service later that day, visibly subdued. She wanted this brooch to say the past was settled. Instead, the public read it as the opposite proof: the past was still very much alive and still very much unresolved. So the signal had been sent whether the palace planned it or not. But signals like this one always come with consequences, and Camilla's team was about to find out just how badly their attempt to control the story was going to fail. And Camilla's team went into full damage control mode almost immediately. Within about 18 hours, there was a wave of carefully placed messaging suggesting the brooch moment was a gesture of reconciliation that had simply been misread by onlookers. But here's where the strategy fell apart. Sophie, who'd been in the room for the private conversation between Catherine and Camilla, reportedly pushed back hard on that framing through her own contacts. Her point was simple and honestly pretty devastating. Reconciliation can't be declared unilaterally. If William hadn't agreed to it, and if Catherine hadn't accepted it, then it was never reconciliation in the first place. It was pressure dressed up as grace. That single correction basically dismantled Camilla's entire messaging strategy in under a day. Charles, for his part, ordered a formal review of the Jewelry Archive's approval process, checking who authorized the brooch request and how it moved from Camilla's ask to an actual gown fitting. That review, once word of it leaked, shifted the entire conversation. It was no longer, why did Camilla wear the brooch? It became, who let this happen and how far up did the approval go? She had spent years building quiet influence inside the household, carefully managing relationships with senior staff and advisors, but Catherine had never underestimated her, not once. And that's exactly why Sophie's information was airtight before the banquet even started. Specific consequences followed fast. The stylist who'd built the gown around the brooch was reportedly reassigned to a lower-profile role within weeks. A senior household aide who'd approved the informal archive request was quietly moved off jewelry-related duties entirely. None of it made headlines on its own, but together it painted a clear picture. The people involved in making this happen were being systematically removed from any position where it could happen again. Camilla, according to people close to her circle, understood by the end of that week that the damage control had failed completely. The story hadn't faded. If anything, it had hardened into a permanent example referenced anytime future questions about her position came up. But there was still one thing left undone. Diana's jewelry archive itself hadn't been formally restricted yet. And Charles was about to make a decision that would make sure nothing like this could ever happen again. And then, about 11 days after the banquet, Charles did something that made it impossible to pretend the old system could continue. No statement, no press conference, no drama. He signed off on a new private protocol restricting the use of Diana's most personal jewelry pieces, meaning none of them can be worn publicly again without direct agreement from both William and Catherine. That's it. That was the whole thing done. No public announcement explained the full reasoning. The palace released only a brief line confirming updated guidance on the handling of historic personal items. But inside the family, everyone understood exactly what had triggered it and exactly whose approval now mattered most going forward. Here's what makes this move genuinely significant. Charles didn't just resolve one incident. He permanently shifted who controls a piece of the family's most emotionally sensitive territory. Camilla can no longer request access to anything tied to Diana through Charles alone. That door is closed permanently by his own signature. Camilla accepted the restriction without any public pushback. According to people familiar with her reaction, she understood by that point that fighting it would only reopen a story she badly wanted to close. She'd wanted the brooch to prove the past no longer had power over her. Instead, it proved the opposite. The past still shapes what she's allowed to do and who gets to decide it. William, for his part, supported the new protocol immediately and without hesitation. For him, this wasn't really about jewelry at all. It was about making sure his mother's memory could never again be used as a tool for someone else's public image, not without his direct say. Catherine didn't ask for more than that one boundary. No apology to her, no further confrontation, just a rule quietly signed that closes the door Camilla had tried to open. And that's the final image from this whole story. Camilla, in a private chapel days later, still wearing black, still visibly subdued with an empty space on her gown where the brooch used to sit. No brooch, no statement, just silence. The immediate story ends there, but what it actually reveals about this family, that's a much bigger question, and it's coming next. When you step back and look at the entire chain of events, what you actually see isn't a story about a piece of jewelry. It's a story about who gets to control Diana's memory 28 years after her death, and the answer as of that banquet is no longer Charles, and it's definitely not Camilla. It's William and Catherine. This wasn't just about a brooch. It was about whether grief can be borrowed for image, whether an old wound can be declared healed by the person who benefited most from it happening in the first place. Camilla wanted acceptance handed to her through a piece of silk and stone. What she got instead was proof that acceptance isn't something you can pin to a gown. Charles lost something too, even if nobody's saying it directly. He lost the ability to manage this family's most sensitive history through silence and careful timing. For years, that was his method: say nothing, let things settle, avoid confrontation. This time, silence didn't protect anyone. It just delayed a decision that eventually got made without him, then forced him to sign it into permanence. And Catherine, she didn't just protect one evening from turning into a scandal. She quietly became the person who decides how Diana is remembered going forward. That's not a ceremonial win. That's real lasting authority, and she got there without a single press release. The Diana layer here isn't subtle once you really sit with it. William was 15 years old when he walked behind his mother's coffin in front of millions of people. He spent every year since trying to keep pieces of her out of exactly this kind of public spectacle. Catherine understood that better than anyone in that family, and that's why she was willing to stand up when everyone else expected her to stay seated. So when you ask who won and who lost here, Camilla lost the ability to use Diana's memory for her own image permanently. Charles lost the comfort of managing conflict through silence. And Catherine and William gained something the monarchy actually needs going forward: proof that dignity still means something inside that family even when it's inconvenient. Loyalty to the crown was never about staying quiet. It's about knowing exactly when quiet stops being loyalty and starts being complicity.